Recently, I brought up the subject of the word salvation, and that word is related to the word save, to the word salve, to the word salvage, to the word safe. I want to talk about risk a little bit today, a particular form of risk. And when we're talking about salvation, we're talking about being protected from a particular risk. So there's a risk that's present or that is predictable that can occur, and our salvation from a particular risk or danger or threat could be a certain practice, a certain ritual. There's a variety of ways that we can use the word salvation. It could be a particular person, a particular membership in a particular group, such as a association or a privileged exclusive club like citizens of a certain country. There's a variety of backgrounds. But before we talk about protection from risk any further, I want to talk about one of the most prominent risks in human experience, which is violence from other humans. I want to talk about the value of violence historically and currently, as well as the danger and risk of it. So, when we consider various kinds of risks in our midst, we can start with a small child. I hear a very small child in the background passing by. I happen to be on my balcony sunbathing right now. Early February. I don't know if it's 70 degrees, but I live in the deserts of Arizona, so it's quite warm here, and as I'm sunbathing, there's a child, a neighbor, crying. Now, is the child crying because of a hurricane or a snowstorm? Well, no, not in the deserts of Arizona in February. How about a wild animal? Was there a threat like a shark or a bear? No. The threat that humans experience most often is from other humans, whether that's adults and the parents of a child, or armies, missiles, helicopters, or just individual assailants like a mugger or a robber or a thief. So we also can be at risk because of trends of activity amongst court systems. So a court system or a government can incrementally make particular behaviors criminal, or even make the absence of conformity criminal. So somebody who doesn't take 15 vaccines, or doesn't take all 15 out of 15 vaccines, could be a criminal in a particular situation. And the violent, armed thugs of the court system would come to them and say, you have to either take this other vaccine, or we're going to confiscate, we're going to kidnap you and put you into a holding tank cell by force, or whatever their threats are. We're going to execute you in a ritual of human sacrifice. We're going to force you to join the military draft. Whatever their punishments may be, they're all around the threat of violence. So then the court system would say, now, we've added another 6 vaccines, now you have to do 21 out of 21 or else you are a criminal. So there's a variety of legal actions that are the criminalizing of inaction or action. It could be only if a slave does a certain action, or only if a female under the age of 50 does a certain action, there can be all sorts of conditions that lead to a criminal charge. If you're a U.S. citizen and you do something, well, that's fine. But if you're not a citizen of the U.S. and you're in the territory claimed by the U.S. and you do a certain thing, well, then in that case, you could be deported. You can't get a job here without complying with whatever regulations. So, or you're not allowed to. You can, but if you do that, then there are possible consequences. There's danger. There's a threat of violence in the background. So now I want to turn to the subject of how violence is useful to people like me who happen to be in the U.S., U.S. citizens. I'm relatively safe. I have a small amount of savings and not especially anxious about the organized violence of the court system at this moment. I have been at other times in my life, such as in the moment of speeding while driving a car or whatever. I certainly might be more anxious in a particular moment. But overall, we in the U.S. are the beneficiaries of an immense concentration of violence. So in the 20th century, in particular, the U.S. rose from not being all that prominent of a military power to being the dominant force of tyranny on the planet, with hundreds of military bases and military assignments across the planet, not just dozens within the U.S., not just one or two or five, but hundreds. And most of them, the vast majority of U.S. military bases, are not in the U.S. The vast majority of influence that the U.S. government exerts is outside of the U.S. So it's an empire. It's an imperialist power. And when I say it, I mean us. We could say us. Certainly a 2-year-old crying in the background, or myself haven't necessarily been particularly involved in the founding of the U.S. military empire, but we're in the midst of an empire. We can get things like bananas, shoes, glasses, like eyeglasses, or what I actually meant was like a glass cup where you can put water into it or other liquids. There's a immense amount of items that are available in the U.S. that are actually from some other place. Electronics, this recording device that I'm using right now, quite possibly was assembled in Asia or India in particular. So, with the immense influence and intimidating brutality of the U.S. military with dropping bombs on civilians, like in Japan, with invading countries, with setting up blockades and embargoes and supporting governments of dictatorships throughout the world to advance the national interests of the U.S. so that those civilians in those places will obediently perform their agricultural jobs, so that avocados can be sold in the U.S. for 50 cents or 20 cents or $1 or whatever it is, but they'll only be costing like 3 cents at the point of purchase. Big profit margins for the U.S. corporate interests, and those profit margins are possible because of the immense bullying influence of the U.S. military. So in the U.S. we can have many people receive thousands of dollars a month for free from the government for causes such as being unable to see. They're blind. They're unable to see from birth. And a person in the U.S. with that particular situation will receive, let's say they receive a couple $1,000s a month, more or less, for their entire life, whether or not they contribute economically to any productive activity. Why is it that that individual can have so much privilege? Well, it's because there are people throughout the world that are laboring intensely to make that avocado grow that's going to be 3 cents when it's sold to whatever U.S. corporation, and then the U.S. corporation imports it into the U.S. from wherever it was grown and sells it for 50 cents or $1 or whatever they sell it for. And they make great profits. Why? And then the beneficiary of the Social Security disability benefit will contribute to the profits of the greater U.S. system, so that more violence can be done internationally to bring more inexpensive goods. So those people who are outside of the U.S. that are in the third world, they might work 70 hours a week and they make a couple $1,000s a year, or maybe several $1,000s a year, while the person in the U.S. who is disabled or whatever the situation may be, they may earn thousands of dollars a month for no activity, just as a privilege for being in the U.S. In the state of Alaska, there's actually a dividend, or basically a payment made to citizens of Alaska after they've been there for a few years as residents, of Alaska. Then they qualify for thousands of dollars a year of a subsidy. So basically to encourage people to come to Alaska, given that it can be that there's a relatively high standard of living, relatively high cost of living in Alaska. The government of Alaska encourages people to come there and live there and work and be part of the oil industry or whatever other industries are there. And the oil industry is probably the biggest industry in Alaska. I haven't researched this, but the reason that the state of Alaska can give thousands of dollars every year to every resident of Alaska that's been there for 3 years or whatever it takes to qualify, the reason the government can do that is because of the immense profits from selling oil from Alaska to the rest of the United States in particular. And with that huge cash flow coming into Alaska from other parts of the U.S., the government of Alaska takes a portion of that in taxes and fees and trying to think of the tariffs and other terms that might be used, but any of those ways that the government says, look, we're going to do violence to you unless you pay into this fund at this percentage or according to whatever regulations. So the state dictates or declares what the rules will be, and then because of that power and coercive influence of the state, businesses will generally comply, and huge funds can be generated where the citizens and residents of Alaska can be given these stipends. So they get money from the federal government, money from the state government, in the case of Alaska, and they use that money to purchase things that are created in many cases by people within the third world who are not necessarily slaves, but they may work 50, even 70 hours a week. They could be working from the age of 9 or something. If they're in certain parts of the world, that would not be unusual. And we in the U.S. are the beneficiaries of the labor of a huge amount of the world. We can be grateful for this. We can acknowledge it. We can also recognize that the violence of the United States is a central factor in those people in other parts of the world having so little compensation. It's like if you have a inmate in a jail. They may be given the opportunity to work for 12 cents an hour or 9 cents an hour in jail. Now, in normal circumstances, that would be a criminal act to employ someone and only pay them 9 cents an hour. However, in jails, that's common. So the people get, a very, very, very small compensation for whatever work they do as an inmate. And the reason that they're working for that small amount is not because they choose to, it's because they are trapped by violence to be in jail, and then within the context of jail, their options might be don't work at all, have no income, make 8 cents an hour, or make 12 cents an hour. Similarly, in the third world, people may have a rather limited set of alternatives. They don't necessarily have access to $40,000 a year jobs or $4,000 a week jobs. They are targeting $4,000 a year as an income, and they're expecting to work very hard, perhaps under very unhealthy conditions to do that. So we in the U.S. can be, we have the luxury of criticizing our government. We have the luxury of complaining about the imperialism of the U.S. for the last 60 years or 190 years or whatever time frame we might pick. And we have these luxuries because of the efficiency and effectiveness of the systems of organized violence of the U.S. So that's something we can be grateful for. And when it comes down to the issue of salvation, it is true that other humans, whether they're the Puerto Rican National Liberation Movement or whatever, that want the U.S. out of their country because of the immense violence that the U.S. is conducting there. Whether it's, I lost my train of thought. The violence of, oh yes, so we may be threatened by violence. It could be a shark, a hurricane, but again, back to the issue of humans. We could be threatened by violence of our fellow, people within wherever we live, whether they're illegal immigrants or poor people or people who are on, some kind of a serious neurochemical imbalance situation where they're just kind of panicking and freaking out, and they're wildly violent, or somebody who's desperately violent because of an economic sense of panic. Or in other parts of the world, people could be angry. They could be violent towards us in the U.S., whether it's large groups or individuals when we go and travel, or they come to the U.S. and may want to retaliate for the decades of violence that the U.S. has conducted in other parts of the world. So those are things that we can accept as possible outcomes and possible developments, possible threats. So we may want to take actions to be on the side of the court system, on the side of those who are very well trained and very willing to go out and do violence. So if we're a landlord and we want to hire some armed thugs to kick out our tenants who we don't want as tenants anymore because they're not paying as agreed, then we hire the thugs to go and perform an eviction proceeding, for instance. Or there's a variety of things, a foreclosure auction, a garnishment, a levy. There's a variety of legal actions that we can take to have somebody arrested, or to have somebody have their property confiscated, or have them kicked out of a dwelling or a building, have an order of protection, or restraining order. So there's just a huge variety of things that we can do as individuals to activate the wheels of violence that the court system offers as their service to the public. So many people in the public don't relate to the court system as a service. The service they offer is violence and intimidation, bullying, the threat of violence. And if we relate to the court system as a group of mercenaries that we can either afford or not afford, we can at least have a sense of clarity about, what they do and how they function and what moves the wheels of justice. If I have $600,000 and I wish to hire a lawyer to advance my interests in a civil lawsuit or in a criminal defense situation, $600,000 can make a difference in regard to the outcome of the legal proceeding. If someone has $6,000 or $600, they might not be able to produce as valuable results as the person who invests $60,000 or $600,000 in a particular court procedure. So we know that justice is, or the activity of the court system is responsive to money, to wealth, bribery, if you wish to call it that. We know that. That's really not in question. The question is how much responsiveness will there be in a particular case, because there may be cases in which however much money is thrown at the government, it won't matter. I talked recently in a private conversation about various kinds of legal immunity. And Bill Clinton pardoned his brother I think it was for cocaine charges or something. And presidential pardons in the U.S. are common. Every president, except for two in the history of the U.S., have issued presidential pardons. And the reason those two did not do any presidential pardons is because they were killed in office or died in office prior to having the opportunity to issue any pardons. But there are many cases where people like Caspar Weinberger was pardoned. He was, there's many cases where clearly there's illegal activity, there's been convictions, and yet a president who might be friendly with the criminal will issue a pardon. Or maybe a criminal provides a donation of $100,000 or $200,000 to the Republican National Convention Fund and then gets a pardon for their illegal donations that they made directly to the Ronald Reagan campaign, for instance. And I don't remember the name of that guy, but I'm talking about a very specific case. George H.W. Bush gave a pardon to somebody in a case like that. So it's interesting that people aren't talking about the open bribery of the court system in regard to the fact that hiring a $10,000 or $100,000 lawyer is typically going to promote somebody's legal interests. It's going to favor certain outcomes. To be somebody who's making a campaign contribution of $2 million or whatever it may be. Like, the idea that wealth doesn't influence government is nonsense. Every government on the planet is influenced by other governments, by threats, by intimidation, by alliances, by donations, by bribes, by offers of wealth that are implicitly with strings attached, where one government says to another, we're going to give you financial aid in the form of a loan or in the form of a $3 million donation, But when we do that, we want your government to take the following actions in regard to agricultural workers within your country. Or we want you to take the following actions in regard to political prisoners that you're holding in your country that are hostages of our country. We want you to hold them until the next election is over. So we don't want Jimmy Carter to have the glory of the Iranian hostages being released during his presidency. We want to wait until after the elections, and in fact after the inauguration. So minutes after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, the Iranian hostages were released. I believe this was in 1980. The idea that one party or one nation is particularly better or worse than another as it relates to the use of violence or bribery is based on some pre-existing ideal about what better or worse would be. The bottom line is, through diplomacy, through negotiations, through threats, through intimidation, through whatever means, the presidential campaign of Ronald Reagan was a success. Even if you have to have the Supreme Court come in and overturn, invalidate certain votes to make you have the most votes, so be it. If you have to use nuclear weapons, if you have to use tear gas, if you have to use bribery and bribe all the public with $600 per household, there's a variety of ways for politics to manifest. And in the perspective I'm bringing of salvation, I'm not saying that we should be saved from the influence of politics. I'm saying we should be saved from delusions about politics, or we can be saved from delusions about politics. We can be clear about politics and recognize the risk and danger of worshiping propaganda ideals. We can simply recognize that violence is important. Violence is a real threat. Just as we're really threatened by hailstones and hurricanes and earthquakes, we're really threatened by nuclear missiles and hand grenades and SWAT teams and swords. And we're really threatened by legal actions because we know that the court system is able and willing to overwhelm individual people and small groups of people with violence. The organized violence of the court system simply is effective in the vast majority of cases. Now, there are countries where their court systems are not as dominant. There are places within the U.S. where the court system's influence is not as total. So the totalitarianism of a particular government varies. It's on a spectrum. So in some neighborhoods, the police in the U.S. may be very hesitant to enter that neighborhood because they experience a sense of danger and threat and risk in entering that neighborhood. So the idea of salvation would be first to recognize, someone has to recognize the presence of risk closely. The particular people who are protected from risk do not need to know. A 2-year-old doesn't need to know. They just benefit. They just, cash the check because they live in Alaska or because they're a U.S. citizen. They just receive the benefits. But in other cases, it can be useful to at least have a general idea of the existence of a threat and even to have precise awareness of what the threat is and how much threat there is from a particular source. And then, here's where salvation comes in. How to powerfully interact with those possible threats, with those bullies, those dangers such as market fluctuations, economic change, as well as earthquakes and hurricanes. Obviously, if a hurricane is coming to a certain area and people know about that, then they can take precautions. And then at the end of that, they could say, wow, it was really my salvation that we had the National Weather Forecast warning us about it and that we had so much extra water. So when electricity went out and water service went out, we were able to thrive, and we put up, it was also our saving grace that we had lots of plywood to put on our windows so the windows didn't get, broken during the storm. So there's a variety of things that people can say, but salvation just becomes a general term for anything that promotes the welfare of someone, anything that promotes their health, in particular, anything that reduces risks or prevents exposure to risk. So maybe the risk is out there, but we have boards on the window, or we have a respect for the military dominance of the court system's mercenaries. And if we have respect for those mercenaries, then our respect for them can actually lead to them generally leaving us alone, and people who are more antagonistic towards the court system will typically be baited into some kind of a criminal act, at which point then the court system can target them and crush them, generally speaking, or overwhelm them. This covers a variety of points here, and I did not have a script, as you may have noticed, and I didn't have a particular conclusion that I wanted to make, but in general I just wanted to reinforce the importance of the idea of organized violence in general, but in particular the organized violence of governments, as well as groups like the Society of Jesuits, the Freemasons, the military order of the Knights of Malta, the mafia, any of the informal or non-governmental private mercenary groups, Blackwater, any of those groups. We can just recognize the diplomatic significance, the political and economic significance of organized violence. When the marijuana laws and other drug laws are being reviewed in the U.S., the groups that may be most in favor of maintaining criminalization may be the drug smugglers that have huge profit margins because they've got connections, they've got the economic affluence to operate in the midst of criminal threats. So that keeps out a huge set of competition. So when some substance like marijuana is decriminalized, it can dramatically reduce the cost. It typically would dramatically reduce the cost to make something re-legalized or decriminalized. So that covers a wide range of things. Obviously, there's the implicit value of court systems and their violence and their activities of criminalizing certain behaviors, criminalizing certain kinds of inaction, like to force or to encourage people to use a particular vaccine or whatever it may be. There's a variety of influences that they exert over the masses, and the core of that is their threat of violence, but then there's also, of course, the immense efficiency that can be produced through propaganda, through public education, through mass media, and also through churches, where people can be exposed to a particular idea and programmed to respond in a particular way, programmed to take certain actions or to avoid certain actions.